everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're going to talk about Black Widow and its recent big success at the theatrical box office within the US. Now, after being released on July the 9th, it's managed to gross over 80 million at the US domestic box office, which for me overall was a great achievement. Now, we all know the story behind Black Widow. It was originally slated for release way back in May 2020. It got delayed, of course, during the COVID pandemic, and of course this would have taken away a lot of the hype and excitement away from the original project, since it's been well over 12 months now since we've come to the movie finally being released. Now, we could also be argued that the hype wasn't quite as high because it was a prequel story taking place shortly after the events of Captain America Civil War, and we already knew Natasha's fate following from Avengers Endgame, so the story really wasn't essential in terms of the overall cinematic universe. We also have the factor it was released simultaneously on Disney Plus, and that Marvel used the same day and date release option with the premium fee of $30 charged in order to watch it streaming at home. Now, that would have undoubtedly taken a big chunk away from the box office this weekend. Now, in previous videos, I've always stated that it was overall a mistake from Marvel to put it on a simultaneous release within Disney Plus. We've seen recently within theatrical releases, when we look at the likes of Godzilla vs. Kong, A Quiet Place 2, and most recently, of course, Fast and Furious 9, which itself grossed over 70 million at the US box office a couple of weeks ago, we've really seen a return of sorts from theatrical releases in terms of attaining a big return at the box office. And in particular, both A Quiet Place and Fast 9 didn't use a simultaneous streaming release. So that backs up the fact that many people are now prepared to come back to cinemas to watch these big blockbuster movies. So that's why I felt Black Widow should have stayed a theatrical release only. You have to remember, it is still an MCU movie, which is still the most certain box office franchise, and certainly has been for the last 5 to 10 years. It is still loved by the majority of the general audience. Scarlett Johansson is one of the most prolific leading actresses today, and she's very well liked, and her Black Widow portrayal has culturally been one of the best known female superheroines since her first appearance in Iron Man 2 in 2010. And that's why I honestly feel that after they just stuck to their guns and made Black Widow just a theatrical release only, it could have gone on to gross over $100 million at the box office weekend. Now, when we look at the international markets within Black Widow, it has managed to gross over 78 million, given the worldwide box office take so far of 158 million. And I think, again, that's very impressive in the fact that we are in this pandemic or post-pandemic climate, and the fact it was released online in streaming. Now, according to various other reports, it's managed to gross around 60 million from its Disney Plus subscriptions. Now, I'm always cautionary when viewing streaming numbers because they can very much be manipulated by the platform that's releasing them. In terms of the overall box office, we can always rely on the cinema chains to release accurate numbers in terms of a box office performance. But when it comes to the streaming content, it really is down to the overall studio and the franchise itself. So we can never fully trust on how well the numbers are releasing. They're not going to release a movie if it's done particularly badly, are they? So that's why we always have to be skeptical when looking at these numbers overall. And I've seen various articles trying to inflate the international performance of Black Widow by including the streaming figures. So certain headlines have deemed that Black Widow has taken over 218 at the box office. Now, I don't accept that, and that's really a cheating move in many ways to try and inflate the numbers, and I hope that's not something that we see going forward in terms of the future reporting of movies and their box office performance, with studios trying to overhype the performance of their content and trying to really fool audiences into indicating on how successful their movies are being overall. Forget about the streaming numbers. I primarily look at the box office theatrical take for these movies. We then have to finally talk about the various narratives or the perceived drama online surrounding this movie. Now, ever since the fallout, in particularly of Captain Marvel and Avengers Endgame within the MCU, there's been a growing antagonism, I'd say, against the MCU, primarily within online fandom. Ever since they announced their plans for the Phase 4 movies and streaming shows, there have been certain factions that have felt that the MCU has been taken over by social and diversity politics, following in particular the Captain Marvel drama and certain scenes and sequences that we saw within Avengers Endgame. Many have felt as well that the 3 Disney Plus shows, WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Loki, have all been plagued by tokenism and woke initiatives. And reviewing certainly a lot of the recent coverage, I've noticed that there seems to be very much of an eagerness to see Black Widow fail at the box office, and that any underperformance from the movie will signal the beginning of the end of the MCU, and that the Marvel era, in terms of its dominance within all the franchise entertainment, will finally collapse following the underperformance of Black Widow. Now, not to be insulting to anybody, but I think the idea of the MCU collapsing following any underperformance of Black Widow is simply ridiculous. We all know how big, how integral, how influential the MCU has been for the last certainly 8 to 10 years overall. In particularly, the last 5 to 6 of their live action movies have grossed well over $1 billion. When we look at the likes of Spider-Man Far From Home, Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, of course, Captain Marvel and Black Panther. So in terms of a franchise entity, the MCU is without question the most certain box office studio within all of fandom and with all of entertainment. So the fact that all of that reputation and goodwill and brand recognition can be brought down by one singular movie, for me, is just implausible and doesn't really garner any logic or validity. So why is this? Why is there seemingly an almost desperation to see the MCU fail? Now, I think in particularly of Black Widow as well. Now, I think this is partly because certain fans online are continually frustrated with the constant identity politics that has plagued their favourite franchises. So of course we look at the likes of Ghostbusters, Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, and they now feel that any big blockbuster franchise can't be true to the source material or the characterization. It's always got to be led by virtual signalling and woke politics. And I think this to an extent clouds their overall view and open-mindedness when it comes to reviewing certain films such as Black Widow. Now, of course, many of the negative content towards the movie is orchestrated for clickbait and views. I get that. That's just the nature of social media. That's been around for a long time. And no doubt about it, we saw how many people profited from the negative outrage surrounding the likes of Captain Marvel and of course Star Wars The Last Jedi. Now, in terms of Black Widow, the drama or the perceived drama surrounding this movie has followed recent disparaging comments made by actor Stephen Dorff towards Scarlett Johansson, stating that he was embarrassed for her and that these comic book movies were not really what he would deem as proper films, and he doesn't really look to star in them, even though of course he starred in one of the best comic book movies of all time in Blade way back in 1988. We've also had many people linking to the recent Scarlett Johansson interview where she stated that she felt the character of Black Widow was hypersexualized when she was first introduced within the MCU way back in Iron Man in 2010. Now, all of these elements for me have no bearing on the quality of the box office or its overall quality as a movie, yet people have tried to use these elements to try and gain a certain overall critical consensus of the movie weeks, months before it comes out. Now, I've never understood this. Now, we've seen this pattern established multiple times. I've mentioned before with both Captain Marvel, when many people were denouncing the movie several months before it came on release. Now, yes, of course, you can give overall impressions in what you think in terms of the plot synopsis, the plot outline, the overall impressions in terms of the trailer, but until the movie actually comes out, you cannot give an absolute critical review or judgment over how good or bad it is. Now, I know a lot of people don't want to accept that, but sadly, that is the case. You cannot assess how good or bad a film is until you've seen it. So when I look a lot of this negativity and this outrage surrounding the movie prior to its release, I just think it's a shame overall in terms of fandom. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you have to like the Black Widow movie. If you watch it and you like it or you don't like it, then fair enough. You're entitled to your opinion. You're entitled to have your say. But I don't agree with willing the movie to fail, willing the movie to underperform. And I think a lot of this as well is down to people wanting to very much validate their own predictions and assumptions throughout the movie. So when they go into this movie, they've already come in there with very much of a preconceived bias, and instead of judging the movie on its own as a standalone piece of entertainment, they're very much looking for anything that ties to what they were perceiving the movie to be weeks and months before its release. And then if they see a moment or a certain scene where a female character talks down to a male character, then they'll use that scene in particular to further support their arguments and their predictions and validate their own preconceptions towards the movie. Now, I've never agreed with that attitude towards reviewing content. Me, myself, I've commented many times within videos how I never liked the idea of the DCU, and I felt that it really did a major disservice to the iconic DC characters. But whatever my own attitudes and feelings towards the DCU, I cannot sit here right now on this current day and tell you that the upcoming Flash movie will be absolutely terrible, because I don't know. It could be the best film ever, it could be the worst film ever, but until I view that movie overall, regardless of what I think in terms of the multiverse and the introduction of the likes of Supergirl and Michael Keaton returning, maybe that's just a nostalgic cash grab, along with Ben Affleck's return as Batman, regardless of how unconvinced I am in terms of all of the elements, I cannot sit here and make an absolute judgment within the movie. And I think a lot of people should take that approach when going ahead for Black Widow. By all means, once you've seen it, if you deem it to be the worst film ever, the worst film from the MCU, and you think it's an indication that Phase 4 will really be the downfall of the MCU, then fair enough, but at least you've seen it. But a lot of people were making these assumptions weeks, months prior to the release of MCU, before we've seen the trailer, and all they were going on were previous quotes from interviews and certain assumptions that other established people were making online. It's almost as if many people are looking for that next explosion of outrage that we saw, as I mentioned before previously, with Captain Marvel and the Star Wars The Last Jedi. Now, in terms of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's really built such a strong bond and connection and good overall reception with the general audience. And when you are building a franchise, that's really the audience that you really have to connect to. Yes, of course, when you're adapting these comic book characters, of course, you have to stay true to the source material and please the original fans. But if you want the franchise to grow, if you want it to last as long as the MCU, then you have to really connect with the general audience. And I think when we look at the perception of Black Widow outside of social media, general viewers who really don't care about all of the drama or the perceived outrage or controversy online, they have watched Black Widow and at the very worst have seen it as a piece of serviceable entertainment that they can go in and enjoy. It's not overly intense, it's not overly threatening, it's something that they can go in, understand, everything's clear, it's got lots of action and spectacle, and it's got a nice line of humour and charisma within the main characters, and they can walk away from the film being overly entertained. And if you can strike that balance, then you really are onto a winner in terms of your overall franchise, and that's really where the Marvel Cinematic Universe has succeeded for so long over a number of years. So overall, when we look at Black Widow, in that basis, in terms of satisfying the general audience, or the normies if you like, it's done a satisfactory job. It's literally proved all the haters and the doubters wrong at this stage. Now, people will, of course, wait until the second box office weekend. And if we look at it realistically, of course, we're going to accept the fact that it will have a big drop, primarily because the movie is now streamed online. So many people can view it at the leisure of their own home. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, once you release that video online, it is subject to piracy. So many people will be looking to attain bootleg copies of the movie. So yes, all of these factors will contribute to a very steep second weekend drop. Now, I would anticipate that it's probably going to hit around maybe 30 to 35 million in its second box office weekend. We saw a similar situation with Fast 9 that experienced, I think, around about a 60 to 70% drop in its second weekend. So we anticipate that. So I imagine anybody who already had negative feelings towards this movie are going to use that. They're going to wait for the second weekend numbers before deeming it an absolute failure. Now, I simply don't agree with that. I think it was this opening box office weekend that was the true indicator of whether Black Widow was going to be a successful failure. And I think overall it's proven to be very much of a success. So when we look at the MCU overall, in terms of the Phase 4 and going forward, really, the true litmus test is going to be both Eternals and Shang-Chi. In terms of both of those films, you're dealing with new characters, you're moving the continuity ahead going forward. In terms of Phase 4, you're going to see very little cameos in terms of the established characters. And both of those properties, if we look at the overall traction and reactions to the trailers that have been released, yeah, it has been very mixed to lukewarm overall, particularly with Eternals, where people can't really seem to get a grasp on what it is exactly in terms of the concept of the story, and we've yet to see in terms of who really the villains are. So those would be the real litmus tests that I would look to see if the MCU can continue to go as strong as it can for certainly the last 8 to 10 years. But certainly to wrap this video up, in terms of Black Widow, it has been a big, massive box office success. Any way you look at it, whether you like the MCU, whether you hate the MCU, whether you're convinced that it can't really get any higher in terms of its phase 4, you cannot deny that right now, 80 million at the box office in this post-pandemic climate, when it had a simultaneous release in a streaming platform on Disney Plus, it's a big win and it's a massive success, not only for Black Widow, but I think it says a certain statement about the MCU, that despite all of the previous connotations and experiences that we've gone through, it still remains the most prominent and the most pivotal box office franchise around. And really, it's coming from a position of strength, I would say. And maybe they may feel more confident about these streaming releases. I personally hope not. I want to see movies go back theatrically. And certainly we have seen, certainly a lot of Warner Brothers, after announcing a huge slate of their movies going to streaming platform, they now have introduced a 45-day window. So movies will come out theatrically and then it will at least be 45 days before they go on streaming. That's what I want to see going forward for all studio franchises, for all movies, because we've got to give the cinematic industry a chance to bounce back. And also, as I mentioned before in previous videos, movies really make the majority of their money theatrically. That's when they can really make most of their money back and make profits going forward. So we shouldn't try to take that away by emphasizing or pushing forward ahead with the streaming platform for releases. That's what I believe overall. But in terms of Black Widow, a huge success at the box office, proving most of the doubters and haters wrong. So unfortunately, it's not the end of the MCU. The Marvel era hasn't come to the end. The Marvel empire won't come crashing down. It won't collapse. If anything, it seems in a much more stronger position following its overall performance. So I think overall, if you are waiting to see the MCU come to end, if you are hating on it, if you want to see it completely destroyed, it looks like, particularly from the performance of Black Widow, that you might have to wait just a little bit longer before that day arrives. So those are my thoughts and feelings on the overall box office of Black Widow in its opening weekend at the US cinemas. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think this is a great sign for the MCU? Do you think you have to wait to the second box office weekend to get a better gauge of how well it's performing? And do you think, like me, that we shouldn't be including the streaming figures in terms of the overall box office? That's very much of a cheat, and hopefully we don't see studios adopting that kind of reporting going ahead in the future. If you indeed have seen the movie, let me know what you think in the comments below. You can also check out my own spoiler and non-spoiler reviews of the movie, and I will leave the links for those in the description as well. Please also hit those like and subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality reporting and content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.